So good evening and welcome to tonight's forum, The Quest for Equality, Progress or Retreat. I am honored to share this virtual stage with an all-star panel, and I thought it best to launch right in, introducing each speaker in alphabetical order, and if you'll indulge me with a mention or two of my own past interactions with them. I was introduced to the scholarly work of Danielle Allen by my former boss, David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, when I worked for the National Archives, and Dr. Allen revolutionized the study of our nation's founding document with her book, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence and Defense of Equality. And years later, I first heard her speak when she gave the keynote talk at the National Humanities Conference a few years ago in Salt Lake City. And like many, I was deeply moved by her family memoir, Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A., which was also excerpted in The New Yorker, and by her frequent essays, opinion pieces, and media engagements. She's the former chair of the Mellon Foundation Board, past chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board, and winner of the Library of Congress's 2020 Kluge Prize for achievement in the study of humanity, and she's a university professor at Harvard University. Like others, I cheered when, in 1999, former Governor Paul Cellucci named Margaret Marshall to serve as Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, the oldest appellate court in the Western Hemisphere. And Justice Marshall was the first woman to serve as the Chief Justice in the court's 300-plus year history. In the course of her term, she wrote more than 200 opinions, including the groundbreaking decision in Goodrich versus the Department of Public Health that declared that the Massachusetts Constitution does not permit the state to deny citizens the right to same-sex marriage. Born in Newcastle, South Africa, she was active as a student in the anti-apartheid politics of the time. In fact, in June of 1966, as the vice president of the National Union of South African Students, she officially welcomed then United States Senator Robert F. Kennedy to South Africa in place of the union's president, who had been banned by the government from playing that role. Justice Marshall emigrated to the United States to escape political persecution, earned her law degree from Yale University, and became a US citizen in 1978. One parenthetical note of historical interest, it was longtime Concord resident, the late Richard Goodwin, who wrote Robert Kennedy's most famous words while he was in South Africa, which are worth repeating here for their beauty and eloquence. Each time an individual stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, they send forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. And I know I stand with our third speaker, Jane Mendillo, in saluting Dr. Allen and Chief Justice Marshall for the ripples, in fact, the waves that they have stirred through their work and in their efforts to sweep down those walls of oppression, many of which we will discuss as part of tonight's conversation. I invoke Jane in this way as she and I had the pleasure and privilege of working together to craft tonight's panel. Jane Mendillo is an American investor and endowment fund manager who was the first woman to serve as president and chief executive officer of the Harvard Management Company, charged with managing Harvard University's endowment. She also previously served as the chief investment officer at Wellesley College. Jane is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a member of the boards of directors of General Motors and Lazard. She was previously a member of the Yale University Investment Committee, Rockefeller Foundation Investment Committee, and the Mellon Foundation Board and Investment Committee, where she served under board chair Danielle Allen. On a personal note, if my team and I have had any success over the past 3 years here at the museum, the wind in our sails has come from the remarkable duo of Jane and her husband, Ralph Earl, who currently serves as the Concord Museum's board president. Ralph and Jane have provided wise counsel, key philanthropic support, and as just one recent example, funded our inaugural Thomas Dugan curatorial intern as part of the museum's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and in partnership with the Robbins House, which is dedicated to exploring Concord's African, African-American, and anti-slavery past. This year's recipient, Ella Altador, is also a Mellon Foundation undergraduate fellow at Brown University, where she's undertaking research on women in the slave trade in Haiti, where her family has its roots. Let me close with just one other coincidence. When Jane and I were considering who to invite to be on this panel, her first two choices were Chief Justice Marshall and Professor Allen, and I happened to be the past chair of the Mass Humanities Board of Directors. And during my tenure on the board, Margaret Marshall and Danielle Allen both received our highest honor, the Governor's Award in the Humanities. Mass Humanities is co-sponsoring tonight's forum, and I want to thank and recognize their Executive Director, Brian Boyles, for the extraordinary work he and his colleagues do throughout our Commonwealth. I've mentioned to our three speakers this evening, I hope our conversation can be wide-ranging and informal, both on the micro and macro level, as if those of you viewing at home are here with us across this virtual coffee table, discussing questions both on a personal and societal level about what we've called in our newest temporary exhibit, the Quest for Equality. Okay, so let me get to my questions. When Jane and I initially began planning this forum, we considered limiting our focus to gender equality and even momentarily to issues of gender equality in the workplace. But in the end, when Chief Justice Marshall and Professor Allen accepted our invitations, we thought it better to widen the conversation to include questions related to race, class, and sexual identity in our discussion. So Jane, I thought I'd begin with you, since you have a direct connection with Concord, and you were actually able to see the exhibit last week, and in an intergenerational context, no less, accompanied by your mother-in-law. And I'm aware that you're currently on your first post-pandemic trip to the West Coast to visit your daughter, who's pursuing her own career in Seattle. So I thought it might be interesting to begin with having you share just one or two observations about the exhibit, Every Path Laid Open, Women of Concord and the Quest for Equality, and our attempt to marry Concord's extraordinary past with the present moment. So, Jane.
Thank you, Tom. First of all, I just want to add my thanks and personal gratitude to Margie Marshall and Danielle Allen for being a part of this forum tonight. I'm so excited to be sharing this panel with you, two of the wisest, most groundbreaking women that I've had the pleasure to know in my life and my career, and who my husband and I are happy to know as friends. So thank you. And thank you, Tom. I did visit the Every Path Laid Open exhibit at the Concord Museum last week with my 92-and-a-half-year-old mother-in-law, Eleanor Earle, and my husband, Ralph Earle. And it was wonderful and inspiring and mind expanding. It's a beautiful exhibit. I was just thrilled to be able to see it. And I encourage anyone watching to try and make a stop there between now and September, I believe, when the exhibit is over. But it ties the suffragettes, the abolitionists, the female abolitionists in Concord, the artists, the authors, including Louisa May Alcott, who, of course, I was obsessed with as a young woman, and even things like a female silversmith, which is something I had never knew existed. But throughout the exhibit, we see examples of the groundbreaking paths that women have taken in Concord throughout history, and then leading into some current examples of scientists, astronauts, and government leaders. So it's just a fabulous and inspiring afternoon.
Great, thanks, Jan. I'll just note last night, so there's 55 current women in Concord, and interesting, like the first lieutenant or first woman to make the rank of lieutenant in the Concord Fire Department, but also Ambassador Samantha Power, so it runs them. But last night, Judge Tejal Mehta, who's a judge here in the Concord District Court, came with her daughter, and she invited about a dozen other mothers who also came with their middle school age or early high school age daughters. And although I was struck that those young women do not understand that women didn't have the right to vote over 100 years ago. It was really, I think, astounding to them. So, so Chief Justice Marshall, since we've decided to open this conversation up more broadly to questions of political, social, and racial equality, I wonder if you could help set the larger stage for us and help us to face what I perceive as a certain level of cognitive dissonance. It's undeniable that we've made progress in many areas where opportunities that were once denied certain marginalized groups are now more available than ever to them. But it's also clear that we are living in a time that's defined by rising inequality affecting these very same groups and others writ large. So what's your response to that statement? Where are we making progress, and where do you see signs of retreat?
That's a very big question, Tom. And I'm delighted to be joined by Jane and Danielle, of course. So let me just say first, I have been remarkably privileged in a way to have participated in 3 great revolutions, and I mean those quite literally. The first revolution was in South Africa, which saw the end of apartheid and the election of Nelson Mandela, and those are where I started. Then coming to the United States, participating in the gender revolution, and then more recently, participating in what I would broadly define as the LGBTQ revolution. And I do think of them as revolutions because I know where I was 50 years ago or 60 years ago, and I know where we are now. However, my starting point was coming to the United States in 1962 as a high school exchange student. I grew up as a young white girl in South Africa in a non-political family, and I took what I saw around me for granted. And it was only when I came to the United States and was exposed to what it means to live in a democracy that I began to question what my life was all about. And it wasn't living in a democracy as much as it was observing the civil rights movement in the United States. It was watching what was happening to try and expand the opportunities for Black Americans to confront the absolutely appalling and consistent over decades and decades of racial oppression in the United States that first opened my eyes to racial oppression in South Africa. And I have to say that sitting here in the United States in 2021, having watched much of the progress towards somewhat addressing racial inequality in the United States, it pains me greatly to recognize that while we have made terrific advances in the United States in some areas, we are still so far behind in others. And let me give you an example. There have been Black and white lawyers in the United States since the founding of this country, wherever you want to start it from. And that the American Bar Association refused to admit Black lawyers to its membership. Not in the 19th century and not in the 2010s and not in the 2020s or the 1930s or the 1940s. It was only in the 1950s that African-American lawyers were admitted to the American Bar Association. And I mention that not to be particularly negative about the American Bar Association, but just to say until relatively recently in our long history, I mean, the barriers to entry into any area in the United States have been great. And of course, much of those formal barriers have been removed. But what I see is terrific advances in many areas on a whole variety, but we still deal with some of the most intractable issues. And it's not just financial inequality, it's health inequality, it's housing inequality in so many different areas. So that's a long answer to, a deeply probing question, but we have come a long way and we have a very long way to go.
Danielle, rather than ask you a question, I think it might be just most appropriate for you to respond to what Justice Marshall has just put forward.
Sure. No, thank you. I think it's true to say that if we look at the history of women's equality in the country, it has been a more or less steady forward movement. We can really talk about progress. And in a very recent period, I think we can also talk about a real building progress for the LGBTQ community. We are obviously seeing challenges on that front now in various ways, but I think still the general arc of movement is pretty clear in a positive direction. In the case of African American equality, it really has been a matter of moments of expansion followed by contraction. So in the wake of the Civil War, of course, we saw the period of Reconstruction and really extraordinary growth of economic emancipation as well as political emancipation, with African Americans serving in Congress and Senate and the like. And then Jim Crow locked in, and we had Plessy v. Ferguson and the other sort of key legal pieces of architecture that built the segregated universe. And not just legal architecture, that was also a period where the tools of cultural memory were really built and deployed in order also to develop a narrative about Black inferiority. So people often don't realize that many of the memorials to the Confederacy, for example, were actually erected in the 1910s and 1920s, as people were trying to create a myth about what the country was and what its meaning was. And then, of course, after that period of contraction, we had the amazing opening of the civil rights movement. I grew up in the 70s, and so I do remember that as a period of opportunity, a sense of possibility and openness. And then in the years since that, it's really been a situation where some numbers of us have gotten incredible opportunities. I mean, here I sit in a tenured chair at Harvard. I truly believe that a kind of tenured professorship at Harvard is the single greatest luxury the world has to offer. And no, that wouldn't have been possible 50 years ago. It wouldn't have been possible 100 years ago. Yet at the same time that this is true, over the course of the last 50 years, there have been these two dynamics. One of this increase of income inequality and wealth inequality that has affected the whole country, and then the other, the sort of rise of mass incarceration. And the two things really sort of work together to trap people in the lower registers of our income spectrum sort of in just really difficult situations, impossible to get out of, and multi-generational conditions of poverty and the like. And insofar as African Americans were already there at the bottom trying to start working their way up, the trap was particularly dire. Add to that, of course, the sort of racial backlash that came with some of the political realignments as the Democratic and Republican parties shifted, and there's a racial animus built into the structures of control and domination, in effect, that emerged from this kind of parallel development of income inequality and mass incarceration. And that's really where we find ourselves now, is sort of trying to unlock something that's like a sort of steel trap that really has been built in the last 50 years. I think it's a whole of society effort to unlock that trap. So I'm optimistic about our possibility of reaching another period of openness. And so the question I ask is really, how can we try to make sure that this one is built on foundations that let us get onto that permanent positive upward arc, as opposed to that repeated cycle of opening and contraction.
Thank you so much for that. I should remind our viewers that we're happy to take your questions. So use the chat feature in YouTube, and those questions will be texted to me. And let's hold on the moment on race, though I promise we're going to return to that later in the conversation. But Jane, I've heard you speak positively about the trends you've observed in recent years while serving on corporate boards, especially related to gender equality and LGBTQ plus issues. So could you share a few observations with our viewers about those trends, where and why you've seen them occur, and what lessons you think we can learn from them and perhaps apply to other areas where we haven't seen as much progress?
Yes, that would be my pleasure. And I do want to say right up front, this is the other end of the spectrum from what Danielle was just talking about. Certainly an area where there has been a lot more progress. When I joined the two corporate boards that I'm members of today, there were one, or I may have been the second, woman on one of the boards, and one of them had a position with several board members being women, but nowhere near the 50% women on the board that they have today. So in just the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a lot of progress in terms of placing women on corporate board. However, 40% of the Fortune 500 companies do not only have one or no women on their boards today. So there's progress in it, but it comes in fits and starts. I believe that overall, 20% of corporate board members are women in the Fortune 500. 7% of the CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies are women. And of those, one of them is a Black woman. So we have seen progress. It's been a long arc. It's generally positive, but there's a lot more room for women to take positions of leadership and to be put in positions of leadership in corporate America, and certainly Black women and Black men who are sorely underrepresented in those ranks.
I'm going to shift our focus again. I mean, there's so much material to cover, but as I did in my introduction, Justice Marshall, I want to pause to pay tribute here to you again, related to the progress related to the marriage equality decision. It was a harbinger of similar rulings in other states, and eventually, as we all know, the U.S. Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. And then recently, and perhaps surprisingly to some, the U.S. Supreme Court, with a different mix of justices, issued a landmark decision extending employment discrimination protections to the LGBTQ employees across the country. So I'm just interested, from your vantage point, what role does and should the courts play in adjudicating issues of equity and inequity in our society? And then are you concerned that just as the courts can guarantee rights to minorities or marginalized groups, that they can also be used to take them away?
So first, let me say that with respect to my role, the people who really, there are three groups of actors in any court case. There's the litigants, and then there are the lawyers, and then least important are the judges. That's my view. And when I think of the case that my court decided in 2003, the Goodrich case, I always pay enormous tribute to those litigants who had the courage to come before the Massachusetts court to ask that their full humanity be recognized, because I cannot imagine what it must feel like, as has been experienced so many times in our history, where you go before a court asking the court to recognize your humanity and the court declines to do so. It takes great courage to do that. And the second, of course, are fantastic litigants. I always like to say to people, now, when you think about Brown versus Board of Education, who comes to mind first? And I hope that most of your viewers will say Thurgood Marshall. And I like to point out he was the lawyer, and very few people knew who wrote that decision, and nor should they worry about it, because unfortunately the lawyers taught them how to write. It has been remarkable. When people used to ask me in, let's say, 2015 to 2020, wasn't I surprised at how fast the revolution had taken place? I like to remind people that it was now more than 60 years ago that the first couple went to a court for the first time to ask that their marriage be recognized. That case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States, with barely a slap of the hand, just dismissed it as wholly, meaningless, ridiculous. And so it depends on where you're sitting in history. On the other hand, you were mentioning earlier, Tom, that some people might not remember that women had the right to vote. There is something rather wonderful when a young law student asks me whether or not there was any opposition to legislation in same-sex marriage. And it's like, yes, I'm delighted that they don't think there was any opposition to that. And so, of course, we've made some progress. Should courts play a role in that? We are a constitutional democracy. We have a Charter of Rights. It's a Charter of Rights that sets forth what our freedoms are. It is not a parliamentary democracy, which is what Britain, for example, had for so long. And one of the things that I've always thought is important in our democracy is particularly for despised minorities, where it is unlikely that the normal electoral process, where majorities have a great deal to say, will necessarily protect despised minorities. And I use despised meaning at any historical point, and sometimes those are religious, minorities, sometimes they're racial minorities, sometimes they're because of sexual orientation minorities. And I think that it has been clear from the beginning that courts have a terribly important role to play in that regard. In some respects, one would hope it should not be a surprise that the current composition of the United States Supreme Court would reach the decision, and I think the decision that you're pointing to, Tom, was a decision in a Title VII cases where the word sex referred to gender or sexual orientation as well. And there are lots of ways that one can interpret what a statute says, and that was a statutory case. But certainly from the beginning, I think courts have played a very important role. I'm looking at the time, and let me just quickly tell our viewers, because I'm so immensely proud of this. The Massachusetts Constitution was adopted in 1783. The justices who sat on that court after the adoption of the Constitution were the same 5 justices who'd sat before the adoption of the Constitution. And the very first case that came to the Supreme Judicial Court was a case that challenged slavery in Massachusetts. Very few people remember that there was slavery in Massachusetts. There was. And the court essentially held that under the opening words of the Massachusetts Constitution, which is that all people are born free and equal. It used to say all men, but it says all people are born free and equal now. That slavery was inconsistent with that. So we very early on interpreted the Massachusetts Constitution in a way that gave meaning to the text of the Constitution. That was not a foregone conclusion. I mean, who knew what a constitution was? And there were 5 white old guys belonging to the old regime, believe me, owing their allegiance to the king over on the other side of the pond, that said, we've got a new document here. We have to take this quite seriously. That was long before people had heard of John Marshall. So do I think courts have a role to play? Of course they do. Of course they do. I just wish that it were a little easier for the United States Constitution to be amended. It is quite easy for a state constitution to be amended when judges get it wrong. That's for sure. And we do get it wrong.
I have to interject, though, as a parent of a gay child, I have been inspired and moved by Chief Justice Marshall. And we should note that Massachusetts was the 6th jurisdiction in the world to allow same-sex marriage. And the others were the Netherlands, Belgium, Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec. So the Constitution may have been written that way a long time ago, but it was interpreted very progressively under your Supreme Courtness.
You're being very modest, Chief Justice Marshall, but Professor Elm, Chief Justice Marshall just invoked Thurgood Marshall, and I was thinking I'd like to switch also to kind of the courage of those who lead protests in the streets. And one thinks, of course, of Martin Luther King and John Lewis and Diane Nash and others. And I've heard you speak and there's a certain courage that's involved there, but then you need to do it intelligently and effectively. And I've heard you speak in the past, I think you cited the work of Diva Woodley on how the gay rights movement effectively pivoted to using a vocabulary of marriage equality, changing the framework from saying that this was about a particular group of people and their needs to an argument that this is what all people need, that we all deserve to have the freedom to choose to be with and marry the person that we love. That all of us, therefore, are in that group of people who need and want that right. That change drove a huge shift in public opinion. But I want to switch now and ask you, are you seeing that same kind of shift in public opinion on matters of race in the wake of the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement?
I will respond to your question, but first I want to pick up a thread that you and the Chief Justice have tantalizingly left out there, which is the invocation of Thurgood Marshall in the context of protest and the relationship between that and judicial decision making. Thurgood Marshall's legal work was significantly funded, among other folks, by the Prince Hall Masons. It was a Freemasonry society that has existed since the 1770s here in Boston, founded by one Prince Hall, a free African American. He, along with other free African Americans in Boston, advocated for the use of the language of the Declaration of Independence in a definitive way to anchor the idea that slavery should be abolished. So by the time the justices did have the opportunity to interpret that Constitution in 1783, which drew on the language of the Declaration of Independence, Boston and Massachusetts had actually been involved in a conversation driven by activists, in effect, and protesters about the meaning of those words. So they had very much laid the ground for that judicial decision, just as happened, later on in the civil rights movement as well, and as is happening now. And then there's another extraordinary continuity, which is that in this current moment, yes, I do think the Black Lives Matter movement for Black lives is doing a very powerful job of changing public opinion. Some of that is by really lifting up the voices of people who haven't had leadership roles before. So women and people with a diversity of gender and sexual identities, and really asking people to take a leadership role and thinking of the work as one that is about telling a story of how many people interact with each other, collaborate with each other. And so a different model of leadership, which is very important. But here too, actually, the Declaration of Independence has its place in its language of equality. It's getting another definition. The lawyer, Benjamin Crump, who's been the lawyer for many of the families who've suffered from the police killings, just published a book where the last section of it is an incredible sort of exhortation of all of us back to the text of the Declaration of Independence, a reminder that some of those early grievances the colonists had were about the police powers of the British that were being used abusively, abusive use of search and seizure, abusive violation of entry in people's homes, and the like. It's all very, very familiar. And so here we are, where indeed there is a true equality principle in that early document. Prince Hall saw it. The legacy of his later successors in the Prince Hall Masons funded Thurgood Marshall's work and brought that to life there. And Benjamin Crump is picking up that same tradition. So this is one of the crazy things about America, right? That we really do have an amazing set of different lineages and genealogies, all connected to a deep belief in the human value of equality. And yes, the movement for Black lives is once again bringing that to the fore and asking us all to take really seriously what it means for us to look at the incredible diversity of our world, the intersections of identity that people have and experience, and make room for all of that. So I think they are giving us another version of the concept of equality and changing a public opinion as they do their work. So.
I'm going to switch to, again, a different topic, but it's a current one. And Chief Justice Marshall, I know it's something that concerns you. I don't think we need a long answer, but just I've heard you speak passionately about why you're so concerned about this effort to towards voter suppression, why you think that that's such an alarming thing that we should pay attention to.
I mean, first and foremost, we purport to be a democracy, and there are many definitions of a democracy, and I'm not going to, Professor Allen is going to be more sophisticated than I am, but if you don't give everybody the right to vote, you will never have the kind of democracy that you want. And I have said for a long time, I focus on my gender, that women fought for a long time, went to prison, were abused in order to secure the right to vote. And the reason is because if you don't vote, your voice is not heard. African Americans were excluded explicitly. And much of the focus of the civil rights movement, when I first was introduced to it, which was late in its history in the 1960s, early 1960s, was trying to get the right to vote. Because if you don't have the right to vote, and if you don't exercise the right to vote, your voice will not be heard. And so while much of the focus appropriately is on the current absolutely abhorrent efforts of one political party to close down the vote, make it as difficult as possible for people to vote. There's an assumption that that is targeted towards people of color, which it is in part. I want to say to my women friends and colleagues and young people that make no mistake, when you make it difficult for all people to vote, you are essentially heading down towards a kind of oligarchy of a small group of people if you don't have the full right to vote for everybody. So I grew up in South Africa, and when the question of the right to vote began to be first expressed, I mean, there were wonderful progressives, like one of the most revered was Helen Suzman, who insisted that Africans have the right to vote if they were educated and could exercise the vote appropriately. But I mean, I think you can hardly think of a more obvious rejection of that notion than what happened in South Africa. And yet here I am again, sitting in the United States, you know, a citizen of the United States. This is the country which has given me every possible opportunity. And I am listening to people talk about why we should restrict the vote to people who are educated. I mean, I feel sometimes that I'm Alice in Wonderland. I mean, how could we be taking seriously that as a way for the United States to thrive when our entire history has been the greater the participation, the greater this nation is. And for me, I hope that I became a citizen in 1978, I think, that I have voted certainly in every federal and state election. I think somebody once pointed out that I hadn't voted in every local election. I regret that, but I never take the vote for granted. And I think that we are not a democracy unless everybody can vote easily, readily, without barriers, without targets, without qualifications, without showing endless identifications. I think it is the single greatest challenge to our democracy at the present time. And I commend Professor Allen for deciding that operating in the public sphere, running as a public candidate, is a terribly important thing to do. I really do. I think our elected officials deserve our greatest respect, and all of us should be giving them everything that we possibly can to have more and more people brought into this process. I am passionate about it, Tom, in case that didn't.
Jane, I don't want to pigeonhole you as kind of the representative of corporate America, but you, I think, probably read the stories in the paper with a slightly different lens. You're in different boardrooms that others of us might not be. And so, as we all know, in response to the restrictive voting rights laws that passed in Georgia, a number of corporations, Coca-Cola, Delta, the Major League Baseball, took stances against these measures. What role do corporations play in matters like this? What's your sense of that?
I just want to bring up an example of why I'm very proud to be associated with the corporations that I'm associated with today. You know, this past year has been a terrible year for our country and for the world with the COVID crisis. And you might recall reading about this last spring, but when General Motors had to shut down their plant and couldn't manufacture any autos because of COVID, they then turned around within days and called for volunteers and got thousands of volunteers to come back into the factories and make face masks and ventilators, which were desperately needed at that time. And by the way, this didn't happen because the President of the United States asked it to happen. It happened because the leadership of the company and the individuals who work in the company felt that they could help. And they came right to the front and got the job done. And I was very pleased to be even associated with that. I think that corporations today and in our country do have a responsibility to help it when they can and to behave in ways that are going to be positive for the citizenry and positive for the world, and particularly the environment. And, you know, you see things, for instance, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, one of the largest, if not the largest asset manager in the world with $6.5 trillion of assets under management, writing an open letter saying corporations if you want us to hold your stock, you need to think about the social and environmental impacts of your business and improve the way that you operate so that we as shareholders will continue to support you. And in fact, we'll cut out corporations that don't show that they care about the greater good of the world and the country. So I'm encouraged by how today, of course, there's a wide range. I'm not going to say every company is doing a good job, but how shareholders, shareholder activism, and corporate leadership are recognizing their responsibilities and taking them up.
Right. Danielle, I'm going to take a little moderator's prerogative here and ask you if getting a little bit in the weeds, but it's a question that really puzzles me. And that's, I've heard you speak about that a constitutional democracy is not just about majority vote, but it's about a toolkit. And part of the toolkit is majority vote sometimes, and then minority protection mechanisms that are embedded in the Constitution. And the example you give is the Electoral College, which ensures that less populous states weren't perpetually in a weak position in relation to more populous ones. But I've also heard you raise the alarm that voter suppression efforts are undercutting the hard-won commitment this country has to universal suffrage. And so I'm just curious, how does a system like ours adapt to a situation like the one we face today, where the minority protection mechanisms, including the Electoral College and the filibuster, that again are helped in the past to protect the rights of those living in less populous states, but they seem to be at odds of protecting the rights of racial minorities living throughout the country. So you have kind of two minority groups, but it seems like one's being privileged over the other. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Thank you, Tom. So let me first of all just clarify some of the concepts that you were using there, just so everybody can understand the conversation you and I are having here. So it is the case that in broad public opinion, when people are asked to define democracy, they very often will say it's majority vote, that that's just sort of the definition of democracy. And that is, from my point of view, not right. I'm aligned with jurist thinkers like Ronald Dworkin, for those who are focused, or attentive to that literature. But basically, the core idea from my point of view is that democracy is, as its name says, rule by the people, or famously by, for, and of the people. And that means you have to achieve full empowerment of those who are members of the people. The reason this matters is because at the end of the day, human flourishing, from my point of view, depends on empowerment. So by human flourishing, I mean the capacity of the kind of creatures that we are, with our mental capacities, our minds and our hearts and so forth, to forge lives that are full and rewarding and that give us a feeling of well-being, an experience of well-being. And I think in order for human beings to have that experience of well-being, empowerment is fundamental to that. And that's the basic justification for democracy. We need empowerment in our own lives to chart our own individual courses in our private lives, but we also need to be able to take part in our joint decision-making, because our shared decision-making inevitably makes rules and sets constraints on what we can do. So we need both kinds of empowerment. Okay, so that was a long-winded answer to the question of, like, why should we love democracy? Why should we care about constitutional democracy? But then once you recognize that democracy is about empowerment in this broad way for everybody, because of this core human quality that we have of shaping our lives, then you have to understand that the job is to have a toolkit of institutional mechanisms that more or less distribute power evenly within the citizenry. So sometimes you need majority votes, and use majority votes as one of your tools for decision making, but you also do need minority protecting mechanisms of a variety of kinds, and these things have to kind of work together to distribute and balance power within the populace. So now to your question about the Electoral College, that was designed to protect less populous parts of the country. We have things now like the Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution that really helps deliver and secure rights for minority populations. The thing about the Electoral College is that other parts of that mechanism have changed over time. They've been tweaked. And so it's no longer actually functioning the way it was originally supposed to. It's weighted too far in the direction of protecting less populous places. And the basic thing that happened is that we capped the size of Congress in the 1920s. Congress was supposed to keep growing, with the size of the population. And if that had happened, then the relative weighting between more populous and less populous places in the Electoral College would have shifted over time as well. So that's all a little technical and complicated, but the point is that the problem isn't that we have electoral, the Electoral College as a minority protecting mechanism, is that we actually stop letting it do its job by capping the House in the 1920s. It's kind of an accidental adjustment to the constitutional system. I think we need to correct that. I think we need to increase the size of the House to get the Electoral College back to having the kind of flexibility that it should have. And as for the filibuster, I don't give that any constitutional credit at all. That is just a practice that has accrued in the Senate. It's requiring supermajority vote in places that the founders never thought the supermajority vote should be necessary. I get rid of it. I say, let's just chuck it out. No question about that one.
Okay, I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience. So I'm just going to paraphrase this one, Chief Justice Marshall, but it's someone who's commenting on your notion of Black male attorneys being admitted to the ABA, and they want to understand when we're women, and they're invoking Ruth Bader Ginsburg being one of the only few women in law school when she attended. So if you could talk a little bit about, when women's role within your legal profession.
So you're looking at a different aspect of discrimination, which is the admission of women to law schools. But women, in fact, I believe I'm correct, were able to become members of the American Bar Association way back in the 1920s. I think I'm correct about that. The numbers of women were very small. The numbers of African-American lawyers were very small. But I think by the 1920s or 30s, there were more than 1,000 African-American lawyers. And if you were a woman, after some initial reactions, you could be admitted to the bar. And so what I was suggesting is you have formal barriers along the way. I mean, even I went, comparatively late to law school, that is to say, in the early 1970s, and we were still a small minority. I mean, it was more than 5, a small minority, but nobody would suggest that we couldn't be admitted to the bar or become members of the American Bar Association, the Massachusetts Bar Association, the Boston Bar Association. It was very difficult to become a judge. There was one woman judge on the United States District Court, federal judge, that's the trial court. That was great judge, Eliza Bell. She was appointed by President Carter, who one of the things that President Carter is not remembered for is, I think he should be, the number of African-American and women judges that he appointed to the federal bench. There wasn't a woman on the First Circuit, our intermediate federal court here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New Hampshire and Maine and Puerto Rico until the 1990s. So there were still barriers, but I think overall, as women have come into the profession more and more, we have seen some of that some of those numbers increasing. That is not true, for example, in the private sector. Women do well in private law firms. African Americans, especially in Boston, do extremely poorly. I can count on one hand, maybe 1.5 hands, the number of full equity partners in major law firms for African Americans in this city. That is preposterous. So I think I love Danielle's comment about the sort of opening up and then the retrenchment. There have been setbacks for women, but nothing compared to what African American. I mean, I always have a sense, looking at the history and listening to Danielle and to others, of course, that we open up and then there's a kind of smashing down. That's a little different from setbacks and advancing, and that is part of our history in the United States. So that's a long answer to a very thoughtful question. I'm delighted to say that there has been a moment. I was the second woman appointed to the Supreme Judicial Court in its then 306-year history. I am not I'm the first Chief Justice, but not the last. We have a spectacular Chief Justice, Kimberly Budd, who's doing a great job. I was Justice Ireland was the first African-American on the court. Took longer to get an African-American to court, and he was the Chief Justice. And we have had a second African-American Chief Justice, that's Kimberly Budd. So there's progress, but it's not steady. It's 2 steps forward, 1 or 3 steps back. Pick your moment in history.
That's a good segue, Jane. A question for you about how do you think women and people of color can gain better representation in Fortune 500 companies, just in the general corporate world? What are the steps?
Well, I think a big part of this is the transition from education, higher education to career, and then in career mentorship. There are many people who are underrepresented in corporate America and in corporate America leadership, groups of people who come out of college strong and then may not have the opportunities to advance their career because of lack of connections, lack of mentorship. And I think that one of the most important things that we can do, that all of us in our generation can attend to, is who are these younger people? How can we reach them and help them and have them have the experiences that we had that allowed them to allowed us to climb the rungs of the ladder and will allow them to climb the rungs of the ladder. So it really is sort of a pipeline issue, which is something that we talked about a fair amount at the Mellon Foundation. In fact, when I worked with Danielle on that board, and finding individuals who are still college age, who might be interested in careers that will lead them to these positions where they can then be influencing the course of large American institutions is all of our responsibility. It's something we should invest a lot of time and thought in.
Great. I was going to end with asking the 3 of you kind of a personal question, and my personal question to you, Jane, was you essentially already answered it. So I'm going to do my little introduction and then have Professor Allen and Chief Justice Marshall tell a little of their personal stories, and then we'll conclude. And I wanted to bring this back again to Margaret Fuller. Again, the notion of every path laid open are Margaret Fuller's words. In her famous book, Women of the 19th Century, she called for the need to remove the arbitrary barriers that she and other women of her time faced so that, quote, we would have every path laid open to women as freely as to man. Let women think, Fuller wrote. Let them act till they know what they need. If you ask me what offices they may fill, I reply any. And in what would become the most quoted line she ever wrote, she enthused, let them be sea captains, if you will, which in today's age might be the equivalent of let them manage Harvard's endowment, let them be chief justices of the Supreme Judicial Court, let them sit and endow chairs at our finest universities. Jane, my question to you again was, how your experience informs and what advice you would give to the next generation, but you've somewhat answered that. So let me turn Justice Marshall, and you've referenced it already, but if you could talk a little bit more about your first visits to this country early in the 1960s and to a city that we hear a lot about today, Wilmington, Delaware, and then when you return to your native home in South Africa. One very sweet thing, I've been in your presence a number of times when people who are married to their partners come and thank you, and you're very modest and you always look at them and say, tell me your story, thus diffusing the attention to you. Just tell us a little, we had a whole forum for an hour of you telling us your story at the Kennedy Library, but again, if you want to offer just 1 or 2 final observations to our viewers based on the long sweep of history that you've experienced in your 2 homelands. Chief Justice Marshall.
Gosh, well, first of all, as you know, I owe such a huge debt of gratitude to this country for providing opportunities for me that I simply could not have thought about. And, growing up in this tiny, tiny remote village in South Africa, where white women, the notion of having a career was simply not possible. And I really do credit what was going on in Wilmington, Delaware in the early 1960s as that civil rights movement pushed forward up to the north. I remember with crystal clarity, the events surrounding James Meredith. I remember watching an American president being questioned and criticized. It was, as I said to people, in some ways, for me, tasting freedom for the first time, and it changed my life. I went back to South Africa. And of course, the visit of Robert Kennedy, that beautiful quote that you quoted at the beginning of this program, his great Ripple of Hope speech, is what has governed my life since then. If everyone, you simply do a little every day in any small way that you can, and over time, all of those pieces bring together, into, that will tear down the mightiest walls of oppression. I have to say, and I think that this is not unusual, I had an extraordinary mother who every time I said, "Do you think I can do this?" her answer was, "Do you want to do it?" I think parents play an incredibly important role. One of my great sadnesses is, I think each of you on this panel knows, I couldn't have children, and yet I have such confidence in young people today. When I was really facing the most difficult situations in South Africa as a young college student in pretty frightening circumstances, I remember thinking, I'll never trust anybody over the age of 30. I am 57 and I still adhere to that point of view. I don't trust too many people over the age of 30. I listen to young voices as often as I can. That's a roundabout way of saying I couldn't have imagined the life that I have led when I was 5, 6, 7, 10, 14, 15, 16. I owe so many debts of gratitude, but I hope that the one thing that I've been able to do is to say to every young person I've ever met, the world is open to you, just don't accept a closed door. Just push it open, just push it open. Every time, just push it open.
Thank you very much. Reference to parents and children, we have promised Professor Allen that we would try to end on time because she has children awaiting her. I hope you don't mind, I'm kind of setting you up, but I heard you speak once so eloquently referring to Ralph Ellison as one of your presiding spirits. And I wondered if you might share with our viewers why he and his words are so important to you.
Well, he was a beautiful writer, and I think you and I both share an interest in his essay, "What Would America Be Without Blacks?" And when I told that little story about Thurgood Marshall and Prince Hall, right, I was weaving the African-American story into the whole story and making sure that we recognize that everything that we've made in this country has always also been made by Black people. And the same thing is true, we need to say as well, about Asian Americans and the AAPI community and Latinx Americans. And I did want to say that about voting, that if we really look at issues of incorporation in our electorate, it's actually Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans who still have lower rates of participation, registration, and turnout and the like. So I just wanted to say that out loud before we wrapped up this conversation. And so Ellison really taught me in a deep way how to try to knit our stories together. And I think we need that knitting, honestly, just in order to understand who we are as a society. But I would love to just share, you asked about lessons. One thing that my predecessor on the Mellon board, Ann Tatlock, so another woman in corporate America who really was a leader and a ceiling breaker, her piece of advice was slightly different from yours, Chief Justice. If you hit a blocked door, go around. So that's the spirit that I have, has filled me always in my approach to things throughout. So
well, maybe that's why I've got a smashed head and you're still not eloquent and brilliant. Exactly. I wish somebody had given me that piece. everybody under the age of 30 out there who's listening, please follow Professor.
There's always a way around. That was the lesson that she taught me. And indeed there is in my experience.
Wonderful.
Well, Margaret Marshall, Danielle Allen, Jane Mandillo, thank you so much for gracing our stage this evening. It's been a wonderful conversation. We thank all of the viewers who are watching. Please tune in next week on Tuesday. We're having a conversation about the letters of Ellen Garrison, a civil rights leader. Some people refer to her as the Rosa Parks of the Reconstruction era. She grew up in Concord and then tried to segregate or desegregate a train station in Baltimore under the first Civil Rights Act that was passed during Reconstruction. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and good night.